Hello, and welcome to Real Menopause Talk. So far, I've found that many women feel their choice is either HRT or Endure. Today's episode is a must for those who are searching for a natural support through peri to post menopause. My guest is Sarah Davison, a homeopath, coach, and natural menopause expert. She explains how there is deep complexity to natural medicine, but by addressing the individual holistically, it is possible to have a healthy and happy menopause. Sarah, lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for coming on today.
It's a real pleasure, Hattie, and it's so great what you're providing here in terms of this podcast.
Well, we're really looking forward to hearing about what you are able to provide for people as well. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and what your experience of menopause or perimenopause is so far?
Yeah, sure. So I started my kind of career life as a linguist. So I did French and German at school, and I did Russian at uni, and fell in love with Greek along the way and lived in Italy. So I picked up a few languages along the way. And I wanted to do something with that, and I didn't really know what. I didn't want to do the obvious stuff like teaching and translating. So I went into international sales, not really knowing what I was letting myself in for. And I was selling ad space on an international magazine. And I was a bit shocked when I first arrived, but actually it was a fantastic career for me because although I always knew this wasn't my calling in life, it taught me a lot. And it made me realize that I'm fascinated by the psychology of people and, love communication and understanding people to deeper level. So after 7 years of doing that, I really thought, gosh, I have to move on from this. It's not me, and it's getting boring now. So I went back to college and I did a degree in, it was a postgraduate diploma actually in psychology, which is getting a bit closer to the center of what, I'm interested in. And that took me into 14 years as an innovation and change consultant, working for an international agency, helping the blue chips like, Unilever and Coca-Cola and HSBC with innovating. And it also taught me to be a trainer, because part of what I did was to be a trainer. And I absolutely loved that. And I thought, yes, I found my purpose in life. And, with hindsight, I had that part of my life. But then I had a child late. So I had a child at 41. And I think the stress of that consulting job to corporates, which it was very, very full on, and not really having a part-time job at all for a child, part-time in name only, it kicked me into, I now realize with hindsight, it really kicked me or crashed me into perimenopause in my mid-40s. And I had no idea that's what it was at the time, just not a clue. I hadn't even heard of perimenopause. Menopause full stop wasn't on my radar. I wasn't thinking about it. And so I just thought that I was losing it. And so I did what I see in a lot of my clients in perimenopause is I did perimenopausal adrenal fatigue, or I teetered on the edge of burnout. Really, I was weak, I was exhausted, I was having serial respiratory infections, I couldn't think straight, I was dropping the ball professionally all over the place. And I just thought I was losing it. And like many women in the same position, I put it down to stress. And I had lots of stress. But if you add stress to perimenopause, we have less resistance to stress in perimenopause. So what we could have dealt with before, we now no longer can. And that was absolutely my story. And I became really anxious. I was anxious about things that never used to bother me before, that I could do with my eyes shut, but suddenly I was anxious about them. So that was my kind of entry into perimenopause. I didn't actually realize that was perimenopause until I hit my menopause proper and my periods stopped, and I started to read up about it. By this time I was a homeopath, and I went, oh, okay. But the gift of my perimenopause, and I do think that menopause brings us gifts, yes, is that it made me go back to my homeopath. I'd been seeing a homeopath on and off for over a decade, probably by that stage. And the results were so amazing that I really started to get passionate about homeopathy and started reading books and got myself a kit and started self-prescribing. And eventually I thought, you know what, this is so amazing. I want to make my passion into a profession. And so that's what I did. And so I went back to college for a third time and I did a degree in a Bachelor of Science in homeopathic medicine for full time for 3 years and graduated in 2012. And then, during that period, I was going through my perimenopause without realizing it, but being helped by my homeopath. So it was all pretty smooth. And then when I hit menopause, like proper into post-menopause, I then realized what was going on and thought, oh, do you know what? I want to help other women with this. And then I started to specialize.
That is so often the case, that people start to help themselves and then end up being able to help others, which I think is,
Absolutely.
again, one of the gifts of perimenopause and menopause. With hindsight, what were your expectations around actual menopause?
I didn't have any. I wasn't thinking about menopause. If you had asked me at that stage, that age, I would probably have said menopause is several years, decade, whatever, before I get there. Certainly I wasn't expecting anything before my 50s, and I just associated it with hot flushes, like many women, but I didn't know about the ages and different stages of menopause at all. So I didn't really have any expectations because I wasn't thinking about it, and therefore didn't have any feelings about it either. I was just cruising along in my 40s, doing my thing.
With a brand new baby.
With a brand new baby, yes. And a full-on job.
Yes.
Yeah.
How did the anxiety affect you at work and even at home?
Well, at work, it meant that I was turning down projects that I could have done standing on my head. I suddenly felt anxious about them. And I think, my bosses wondered what the hell was going on with me. I was one of the most experienced people there. I was the one that trained all the trainers. And suddenly I wasn't coping, and I was also forgetting stuff. And at home, I think it probably made me much more anxious about the health of my toddler. I got more anxious about him. So yeah, that was really how it affected me.
So you trained to become a homeopath with a new baby, then started your practice. How did that come about?
When I was getting all these serial infections and feeling so awful, I went to an acupuncturist who did acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And what I noticed was, and don't get me wrong, but I'm going to preface what I'm going to say is I'm a big fan of acupuncture and Chinese medicine. But for me at that stage, what I noticed was on the table, with the needles in, I felt great. And then I would get off the table and 24 hours later, I was back where I started. And when I had started that journey with acupuncture, I thought, I'm going to give this 6 months. And my acupuncturist, asked me not to do homeopathy at the same time, which is very sensible because she wouldn't have been able to tell what was doing what. So I stopped homeopathy. And when I just kept relapsing, I just thought, right, okay, I'm going back to my homeopath. And at the time that I went back to my homeopath, I had a really horrible kind of flu, cold, pain in my head, coughing my guts out, feeling horrendous. And my homeopath prescribed, I even remember what the remedies were, but they prescribed 2 remedies to put in water. I threw a fever within a couple of hours with it, and 12 hours later, I was 90% better. And I was like, oh my God, I'd forgotten how good and how amazing homeopathy can be if you get the right remedies. And that is what really sent me down the path to wanting to study it.
Do you specialise in perimenopause, menopause at the moment?
I do, yes, it's my main thing. I've specialised in different things over the years before I realised what I was going through, things like anxiety and digestion and relationships. And actually those things all are still relevant in menopause and perimenopause. But yes, I do. I specialise and I run what I call integrated natural programs, which are based on my experience of how to get results with natural medicine. So my personal experience going through my own menopause is that if you combine homeopathy with nutritional lifestyle advice, then you've got the greatest chance of having success. Because if you see a homeopath, often homeopathy will do it on its own. But if your diet's wrong, or your lifestyle or the way you're doing your exercise is wrong, and for those of you listening to this thinking, well, I have a pretty healthy diet, what's considered a healthy diet in menopause, before menopause, is different when you get into menopause. And it depends on what your particular hormone imbalance is doing, because, not all hormone imbalances are the same. Most of us have different types of hormone imbalances that need different approaches. But if you do homeopathy and you've got the wrong diet or exercise approach for your particular hormone imbalance, it's going to stop the remedies working, the homeopathic medicines. And likewise, nutrition is fantastic. I went to see a functional nutritionist that helped me a lot. And I think that can only go so far to deal with a lot of the emotional stuff, because what I know about menopause or perimenopause is that anything that's unresolved in you, anything particularly emotional that you've kicked under the carpet and you've not addressed, it will come up in menopause. And that's where homeopathy is so fantastic, is it doesn't just address the physical symptoms. It's amazing for mental and emotional, psychological stuff as well.
Are there any red flags that somebody might need to be aware of diet-wise? What might they need to look out for?
Just to preface the fact that I am not a trained nutritionist, that's why I collaborate with a nutritionist on my programs. Mm-hmm. But what I do know, I'll give you some examples. So, for instance, one of the clients on one of the programs that we do, the nutritionist and I, Julie, what we do is the client does the hormone testing, and then she does an intake session with them to understand their lifestyle and diet. And then Julie and I, the nutritionist, we talk to each other about what we both discovered. And what she had noticed with this particular client was that the client was getting up, having a coffee, going for a run, and then having breakfast. That is really bad for your adrenal glands because it stresses them out, because you've been all night without food. So then your blood sugar's dropped, and that triggers the stress hormones, and the stress hormones make all your symptoms worse. In fact, a lot of women's symptoms are to do with stress hormones rather than sex hormones. So what Julie had her do was get up, have something small to eat, like a bit of a smoothie or something, just to deal with the low blood sugar, then go for her run, then have her breakfast and have a coffee last, because coffee is going to trigger the stress hormones as well. And so the other kind of thing that people sometimes do is they go for fasting. They go for intermittent fasting. Now, for some people, intermittent fasting may be okay, but if you have adrenal weakness or you're burning out a bit, fasting is not good, because the same issue, your blood sugar drops, that triggers your stress hormones, that makes everything worse. In fact, I saw a client yesterday who's in perimenopause, and she has a bit of an adrenal weakness, and she decided to do a juice fast. And she was, although she, on one level, she felt good, she was completely wired as a result of doing the juice fast, and that's because of that adrenal relationship. People think they have a good diet if they're not eating too much fat. But if you cut fat out in menopause, that's a no-no, because fats are what the body uses to make hormones. So it's a very specific thing, nutrition in menopause.
Do you find that sometimes clients confuse wired with energy?
Yes, they can do. They can do. And the other thing that they do is that some people, when they have adrenal fatigue, that's the glands that produce their stress hormones or the adrenals, and when those glands are tired, and by the way, they get tired in menopause because they have an extra job to do, which is to produce sex hormones. So it's not just the ovaries that produce sex hormones, the adrenals produce sex hormones. And as the ovaries start to wind down, then the adrenals have to work harder. So when you are adrenally fatigued, lots of women, what they like to go and do is they think, gosh, I'm feeling really tired. I know I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to do a spin at the gym, and that will perk me up. Well, it forces the adrenals to produce more stress hormones, which does give you an initial lift, but then you may feel absolutely exhausted afterwards. And you often get wired because the adrenals are all confused and they're firing off and producing stress hormones when really they should be resting. But our lifestyle often, if you have adrenal fatigue, we get drawn to caffeine and sugar and hard exercise to make ourselves feel better. But actually, that is like flogging a horse when it's collapsed, when actually what you should be doing is resting.
Presumably, if you've got more cortisol and more stress hormones, then it's harder to sleep and you're back
Yes,
into your cycle of
exactly. And
exhaustion.
sleep, of course, is the best repair, but it's the thing that often goes wrong when your adrenals are out of whack and being worked too hard, is that you're overproducing and you can't get you can't get to sleep, or you can't stay asleep. And then the lack of sleep taxes your adrenals even more. So you get into this kind of vicious cycle, and it's really horrid to be in. I mean, that's what I was in my perimenopause.
I've spoken to a few women who have tried herbal remedies, so not necessarily homeopathy,
Yeah.
but herbal remedies, for example, black cohosh, and said it's done nothing for them. So then they have often felt that their only option is HRT, or to just put up with whatever they're having to endure. So they
Mm.
either go the medicinal route or they
Yeah.
choose to suffer, has been somebody's words.
Yeah.
How would you address this?
Well, first thing to say is this is such a common thing that happens. And it's to do with the general lack of knowledge that women or people have about natural medicine. So, typical scenario is woman knows she's in perimenopause or menopause, really needs to do something about it because her symptoms are difficult, knows she doesn't want to do HRT, so then thinks, okay, I'm going to do it naturally, and Googles. And what comes up is red clover, black cohosh, evening primrose oil, things like that. And because we are all brought up in a mainstream medical system where the thinking is one ill, one pill. What I mean by that is if you have one particular diagnosis, which is in this case is menopause, then there is one pill for it. Then they think that if they Google something for natural remedies for menopause, that what comes up must work because it must be one ill, one pill. But it's not like that at all. So in homeopathy, we have 551 medicines for hot flushes. 52 of those are for menopausal hot flushes. So, yeah. And that's not taking into account everything else, because when you see a homeopath, you don't just talk about hot flushes, you talk about everything. In natural medicine, there are many different, whether you're doing Ayurveda or Chinese herbs or homeopathy or Western herbalism, which is what black cohosh is. It is many medicines for one particular problem. And we work holistically in that we look at mind and body and emotion. And that's how we narrow down from 50 to 1, because we're taking into account all the other things about the person, their personality, what other symptoms they have, what's in their history, what's going on for them emotionally. So, self-prescribing things like black cohosh and red clover, it's very hit and miss, as you just implied. And at worst, it could be risky because you may be prescribing yourself something that they have effects. And that's the other misconception about natural. Because it's natural, it must be harmless. It's not harmless. You might actually be exacerbating your symptoms if you're unlucky. And some women will get lucky. Some people have said to me, gosh, red clover, amazing, sorted me out. But that's more luck than design.
If somebody came to you saying, I'm really stuck, all my friends are doing HRT, I can see the benefits, they are singing its praises, but I'm a bit anxious because I don't traditionally go down a medicinal route. What can you do for me? And why should I try homeopathy?
Mm-hmm. So, the first thing to say is that there's a misconception again about HRT being the magic bullet. Now, you might have picked up from some of what I've already said that menopause symptoms aren't just to do with falling sex hormones. They're to do with the state of your adrenal glands that produce your stress hormones. They're to do with the state of your liver. Like if your liver is what we would call a bit congested because maybe you've had a lot of sugar in your diet or a lot of alcohol in your diet, or maybe you've just had a lot of pharmaceutical drugs like, a lot of synthetic hormones because you've been taking the pill for 10 years, then that is going to cause symptoms, plus also the state of your thyroid and the state of your gut, which has a whole family of microbes in it that regulate estrogen. So if any of those 4 things are out of whack, And for many of us, it's more than that. It's not just one of them. It may be several of them. Then HRT just may not do it for you. So that's the first thing to say. And then what could you do? Well, there are many approaches, natural. It's not just about homeopathy. I want to be fair here to the other modalities. You could go to an Ayurvedic practitioner. You'd go to a Chinese medicine practitioner, you could go to a Western herbalist, or you could go to a homeopath like me. I think what's different about what I do is that I'm really keen on getting results for people. And the way I like to do that is to bring a bit of science into it as well. So I provide these programs that integrate both homeopathy and nutrition. So there are two of us. And before you start all that, you do what's called the Dutch test. And the Dutch test is the most advanced hormone test out there, which looks at 35 hormones, not just your sex hormones, like your estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, in detail, because there are different types of each of these hormones, but it looks at the precursors to those hormones, and it looks at the metabolites, i.e. how do you process them in your body. So Julie will interpret that test, and then she will debrief me on a person's Dutch test and say, look, I remember one client we were talking about recently saying, look, this person is producing good cortisol, which is a stress hormone, but as Julie put it, she's got a hole in her bucket. And the hole in her bucket is some form of stress that means she's using that cortisol up faster than she's able to make it. And because I had worked with this client as well and did a big intake session about what's going on for her emotionally, not just physically, I knew that the hole in the bucket for this client was grief. She had not got over losing her mother. And so I knew that as a homeopath, could seal that hole in the bucket, could mend that hole in the bucket by giving her grief remedies. So I gave her grief remedies, and she's so much better now. Like I would say, 80% better just for addressing the grief. That marriage and that integration that I feel quite strongly about for getting results with natural medicine.
We're at that point in life where we've got additional challenges and additional stresses, either with children becoming teenagers,
or leaving.
Yes, or children then leaving home.
And it couldn't be more difficult, really, because that is a situation as like with a sandwich generation. Yes. Is what you've described, where we've got teenage kids very often, or we're dealing with empty nest, which has a grief in itself, and we're dealing with sick or dying parents. I've got a client at the moment on one of my programs who's just doing so well, but when she came to me, her Dutch test results showed that she was right on the edge of burnout. She was absolutely exhausted and, terrible mood swings, but she was in a situation where she had teenage boys at home, sick mother at home, so all of these under her care, and she was running her own business as a lawyer. I mean, it's really made a really big difference for her because it is really calmed all that down, and she's the homeopathic medicines have helped her to put herself first more. Mm-hmm. And to listen to her body more. And so her relationship's much better with her husband now. She's not flying off the handle at, every second. And she's managing her clients much better, having more boundaries. So a lot, and that's the thing that comes up a lot, I find, at this age. For women, I'd hate to generalize, but because I put a biological explanation to it, I often find women don't tend to be very good with saying no, with what I call boundaries, looking after their own needs, not just everybody else's. And what was a bit of an aha for me was that when I found out that estrogen makes us compliant.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So this is why often women start to find their boundaries and they also start to find their voice, I think, at this age. Less estrogen, less compliant, better able to think about balance my needs. It's not like you're going to ignore everyone else, but actually getting in touch with my own needs and how can I balance those with looking after other people. Often this is a time when women find their purpose in the world, or their next level of purpose.
It's an opportunity to have part 2.
Absolutely. And they say the 3 ages of women are maiden, mother, crone. I think there's another stage out there, which is queen. That's what I've heard. So maiden, mother, queen, crone, because we're not going into crone at this stage. In this age, generally in our society, 60 is the new 40.
Yes.
Really. And we've got a lot of life left, and many of us are raising our heads from child rearing and looking after everybody else, going, okay, so what do I want to do with my life? What's my calling? How can I give back? How can I serve? How can I make the world a better place? What can I do to really live my potential?
What would be your one piece of advice to the next queen that walks in through your door? How would she get started?
I would say, do your research in terms of, if you want to do natural, do your research, find out about the different modalities of natural medicine, and maybe even, go to the ones that you feel drawn to, and most therapists do a curiosity call, meet the person you're thinking about going to, find out about how they do the treatment, whether there's a chemistry between you, and take it from there, I would say.
Sarah, do you have any particular courses coming up, or would people discover you on your website, which I will put in the show notes?
I have a number of free things that I offer people in terms of webinars and guides and things like that. So if they they follow me on Instagram at Natural Menopause Expert, and they go to my bio and click on the link there, then they'll go to a link tree and they'll see all the resources. I'm going to post quite a lot, and I try to make it instructional.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
I just wish there were more education and more knowledge for women around what happens, in menopause. Like, every girl gets their pep talk about periods, but who here ever had a pep talk about menopause? I mean, it's great that schools are now teaching it, although I'd like to know what they're teaching, because if they're just doing hot flushes and mood swings rather than 48 possible symptoms, that's going to be an issue. But anyway, something is better than nothing, right? But I think women need to be reminded when they hit 30, because for some unlucky women, perimenopause can start in their 30s, and so many women do not realize that you get perimenopause when you're still having a regular cycle. Mm-hmm. So if I had a magic wand, I would want to get rid of the taboo and get everybody, men and women, knowing what it's about, and that it's a transition that takes an average of 8 years. It ain't going away in a hurry.
No, exactly. We're in it for the long haul. So we need to come out with our crowns.
Yeah. So the sooner you do something about it, the better. I find it's easier to treat women who come to me earlier than when they come to me later, when things have got really chronic.
Thank you very much for your time. It is lovely to meet you.
Likewise. Really lovely to talk.
You can find Sarah at thrivehomeopathy.com, which I'll put into the show notes. Head on over to our website, realmenopausetalk.com, and hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Please send us in your comments, as we always love to hear feedback, and I look forward to seeing you next time.